the way it currently stands, forced labor, slavery takes precedence over rehabilitation and public safety.
Oh, by the way, while the Biden administration gives reparations to everyone but free people, look at the billions he has run over to Ukraine.
We don't have black grocery stores because if you think about it now, just to get in that supply chain, it's almost unheard of.
They don't want the truth to get out. Okay? I don't want to know what my family did or what all these people did and all this stuff like that. Okay? You read that 500-page report.
There's this thing called white superiority and black inferiority. That mindset allows all of the behaviors that we've seen across generations, allows for the construction of these policies and practices and systems and structures that continue to oppress us. This is not a handout. This is a debt that is owed.
You know, Allensworth was like the internet of his time in 1904, 1905.
The total black population in California is about 2.6 million, and then of that, the descendants compose about 2.2 million of that. So California, with a multi-billion-dollar surplus, can absolutely afford to satisfy the international terms for reparations, beginning with compensation.
Any financial obstacle that exists that impedes the success of increasing financial prosperity needs to be dealt with and eliminated.
No matter where we've been, no matter what part of this fight we've been in, we've been harmed, and we've had harm done to us specifically.
When I got to Los Angeles, this was some of the worst segregation I'd ever seen. And remember, I'm telling you, I'm from Mississippi.
Because as you can see, I'm giving you broken history right now, you know? But I had to give it to you guys today. I said, no, I got to show them this because it's so precious and nobody really knows about it.
Black people don't have that kind of luxury. Our historically black communities have been redistricted multiple times.
Now listen, if you can't handle the TR roof, don't tune in.
What's up, family? All right. Once again, Chapter 5, Housing Segregation. It's the California Reparations Task Force report, the Marathon Read, Monday through Friday, right here on EMEN, the Mass Media Group, 8:30 p.m. PST. All right, before we get into the reading, I'm actually going to go to a really quick slide here. I had the great opportunity to speak with two gentlemen, W. James Cobbin and Dennis Biddle, who were ex-Negro baseball league players. And they actually had a tribute game here in Sacramento, California. Went to the game, did some canvassing. I'd like to shout out my mother, well, Cheryl Glass, for being in the building, as well for helping out, passing out flyers. And I was able to talk to these two wonderful gentlemen. We will be posting this on the EMEN, the Mass Media Group website or YouTube page, so please check that out. I'll put also the link in the description. They need our support. It looks like the Major League Baseball League is trying not to give them their well-deserved pensions. So we need to make sure that this video goes viral, that we all support this cause, because we stand on the shoulders of giants. So shout out to James Cobbin and Dennis Biddle. But on that note, I'm going to then pass it on to my esteemed colleague and co-partner in reparations movement. I was gonna say crime, but don't want to say that. So I'm gonna
Yeah,
pass
the
it on.
only crimes committed were against us. Hey, family, it's Kim. Yeah, I'm in the building tonight. Yamoya's been doing such a wonderful job. We're about halfway through with this marathon read report. So I thought I'd step in and give him a little break. And this housing issue is something that's, I've really been impacted by. It's a pretty long chapter, so we're going to break it into two, half tonight and half tomorrow. Like I said, it's a huge chapter because we have faced huge housing harms.
Exactly. So I don't know if you want to start sharing your screen, and then I'll remove the slide there. Boom. There you go. Well, I'll let you go. Take the helm, and I'm just gonna sit back in the cut.
All right. I know you're there. I know you're there. Thanks for the support.
All right, fam. Go ahead, do your thing.
Okay, so chapter 5, housing segregation. Number 1, introduction. After the Civil War, federal, state, and local government officials working with private individuals actively segregated American land into black and white neighborhoods. The housing segregation occurred over almost 200 years and through a variety of different government strategies and policies. These government actions were intentional and they supplemented and intensified the actions of private individuals. These widespread actions and the resulting segregation of African Americans, both nationwide and in California, are enduring badges and incidents of slavery because they continue to affect African Americans. Immediately after the Civil War, the country was racially and geographically configured in ways that were different from the way it was segregated today. Most African Americans lived in the rural South on or near the land on which they had been enslaved, in shacks or former slave quarters. In the cities of the North and South, African Americans mostly lived in racially mixed neighborhoods, even though Black residents lived in housing of worse quality and in back alleys. The average urban Black person in 1890 lived in a neighborhood that was only 27% Black. Since then, American federal, state, and local municipal governments amplified actions by private citizens to force African Americans into urban ghettos, while helping white Americans buy single-family homes in the suburbs. Rural America also became increasingly segregated as Black residents left the rural South for economic opportunity and to escape racial violence and terrorism. As certain segregation methods were declared unconstitutional, local governments ignored them or thought up new ways to reach the same goals. Although the decisions of millions of private homeowners, real estate agents, and landlords settled Americans into segregated residential patterns, it was action by all levels of government which expanded and solidified these settlements into the segregated neighborhoods of today. Between the 1900s and 1930s, local governments actively planned cities to be racially segregated. The real estate industry promoted restrictive covenants, which were clauses written into deeds that prohibited non-white residents from living in the house. By 1940, the average urban Black person lived in a neighborhood that was 43% Black. From the 1930s to the 1970s, the United States federal government built public housing for white Americans, but not African Americans. The federal government helped white Americans, but not African Americans, buy houses in the suburbs. Throughout American history until the 1970s, white residents terrorized their Black neighbors by destroying their property, bombing their houses, and burning crosses on their lawns to scare them away from living in white neighborhoods. For more detailed discussion, please see Chapter 3, Racial Terror. By 1970, the average urban Black person lived in a neighborhood that was 68% Black. Even after the passage of the Federal Housing Act, which outlawed housing discrimination, urban renewal and other uses of local government actions funded by the federal and state governments maintain residential segregation. The problem of segregation has never been corrected. America is segregated in 2019 as it was in 1940, with the average urban Black person living in a neighborhood that is 44% Black. In California, the population of African Americans remained small until World War II, when African Americans moved to the state to find jobs in the war industry. On the one hand, Southern California is an African American success story, as W.E.B. Du Bois wrote in Los Angeles and Pasadena in 1913. Nowhere in the United States is the Negro so well and beautifully housed, nor the average efficiency and intelligence in the colored population so high. And let's just get back up to the top here. While we're talking about that, Black people were instrumental in building up Los Angeles, and now they've practically been gentrified out. In 1910, 36% of African Americans in Los Angeles owned homes, far more than most cities at the time. On the one hand, all success is relative. Federal, state, and local government in California helped create segregation through discriminatory federal housing policies, zoning ordinances, decisions on where to build schools, and a discriminatory federal mortgage policy called redlining. As Robert Joseph Pershing Foster, a migrant from the small town of Monroe, Louisiana, who moved to Los Angeles in the 1950s, said of his first days in California, "I came all this way running from Jim Crow, and it slapped me right in the face." Like elsewhere in the country, the effects of these government policies at all levels continue to this day. In 2021, in Los Angeles and Orange counties, only 34% of Black households owned homes, less than in 1910. Section 3 of this chapter describes the history of U.S. Supreme Court decisions which allowed residential segregation to intensify over the last 170 years. Section 4 describes the state of residential segregation at the end of the Civil War, before government and private action segregated the American landscape. Section 5 and 7 explain how migration patterns across the country led states, cities, and communities to exclude African Americans. How African Americans established their own communities in response, and the racism that they faced in doing so. Section 8 and 8 details the various mechanisms used by federal, state, and local governments to segregate America throughout history. What section would that be? What's your Roman numeral game like? No Roman numeral game. All right, well, we've got some sections that describes the state of housing segregation today and its effects. This other section concludes that residential segregation in America is the result of white supremacist beliefs to support enslavement and is the root of many modern-day racial disparities. In appendix of relevance data or reference, each of these sections show the persisting effects of slavery in the context of housing. 2. Oh, went a little fast there. Let's get back to the top. 2. Constitutionally sanctioned housing discrimination. The reason housing segregation has never been fixed in America is due in part to the Supreme Court, as discussed in Chapter 2, Enslavement, and Chapter 4, Political Disenfranchisement. Although the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution banned actions that continued the effects of slavery, the Supreme Court and the United States decided in 1883 that the federal government could not prohibit racial discrimination by individual business owners and private parties. This ruling later applied to housing. As a result, government and private actors essentially ignored the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and 14th Amendment protections against racial discrimination until Congress passed the Fair Housing Act in 1968. The story did not end there. At the height of segregation in the 1970s, the U.S. Supreme Court popularized the myth that American government had no role in creating housing segregation and therefore should not and could not fix the personal choices of millions of private citizens. 3. The end of the Civil War. Immediately after the Civil War, the country was racially and geographically configured in ways that were different from the way it is segregated today. Immediately after the Civil War, between 1860 and 1900, almost 90% of African Americans lived in the South, and 80% of those who lived in the South lived in rural areas. Many Black workers lived in former slave quarters on the same plantations on which they had been enslaved. Most modern-day scholars agree that white and African Americans lived in the same geographic area in the cities at this time, although in unequal quality of housing. White families lived in front streets and broad avenues, and Black families generally could only live in backyards, alleys, side streets, or their houses were separated by physical barriers. Impoverished shanty towns of unemployed African Americans also appeared around southern cities in undesirable areas like swamps, near city dumps, and next to cemeteries and railroad tracks. Ghettos were built up nearly all southern cities, not always sharply defined, but pretty definite. And in these Negroes must live, wrote Du Bois. At the same time, less than 10% of African Americans lived in the North, and less than 0.4% lived in the Western states. Most lived in urban areas that were much more segregated by neighborhood than in the South, and in worse housing conditions than white Americans. In 1899, W.E.B. Du Bois' landmark sociological study of Philadelphia summed up the situation. Here is a peoples receiving a little lower wages than usual for less desirable work and compelled, in order to do that work, to live in a little less pleasant quarters than most people and pay for them somewhat higher rents. Essentially, families up to 75% of their income, families use up to 75% on their incomes on rent. Doesn't sound much different than from today. As real estate agents raised the rent for Black tenants because they knew many landlords did not rent to Black tenants. Most African Americans living in the North were only able to find jobs serving white families and thus were forced to pay higher rents in the more expensive neighborhoods close to their employers. In California, around the end of the Civil War, African Americans were few in number compared to other racial groups. The 1860 census counted 4,086 total free colored, 17,798 Indian, and 34,933 Asiatic people in California. As a result of their small numbers, Black Californians at the time generally lived in multi-ethnic communities and occasionally also lived in small, predominantly Black communities. For example, a group of 44 settlers, half of whom were of African descent, who traveled from Sinaloa, Mexico, established a settlement that later became Los Angeles in 1781. During the Mexican War from 1846 to 1848, Los Angeles had a significant Black population as former enslaved African Americans were brought to the area. In Northern California, there was also a concentrated Black population along the banks of the Sacramento River in a neighborhood comprised of Mexican and Chinese settlers in that neighborhood. Rowdy young men and boys attacked all three groups and vandalized Black and Chinese businesses. African Americans also lived and worked in multi-ethnic mining communities such as Little Negro Hill near Folsom Lake, California. California had 4 counties with fewer than 10 Black residents in 1890. By 1930, California had 8 counties with fewer than 10 Black residents, which author James Loewen argues is the result of intensified segregation. Author Richard Rothstein argues that after a large influx of African Americans to the state in the World War II, government actions in California imposed racial segregation where it had not previously existed. 4. The Great Migration. Between 1870 and 1900, many African Americans moved from rural to urban areas in the South, looking for better paying jobs. Over the next 7 decades, as violence targeted African Americans intensified in the South, and as Southern states passed laws that relegated African Americans in nearly every aspect of life to worse conditions than white Americans, the promise of better jobs and the illusion of racial equality pulled African Americans out of the South to the North and the West. This is called the Great Migration, and at its peak, 16,000 Black people left the South each month. Historians have identified 3 migration paths out of the South, though not all African Americans followed these paths exactly. The Eastern path carried people from Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas, and Virginia to Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. The Midwest path carried people from Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, and Arkansas to Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, Milwaukee, and Pittsburgh. The Western path carried people from Louisiana and Texas to California and the rest of the West Coast. More Black people moved to California in the 1940s than in the entire previous century of statehood combined. The Black population of California mushroomed from 124,000 to in 1940 to 1 million. Just a little bit over 1.4 million in 1970. By the end of the Great Migration in the 70s, 47% of African Americans lived outside of the South, although many African Americans left the South to escape discrimination. The lingering legacy of slavery, reinforced by government actions at all levels, followed them across the country. Historians have argued that the Great Migration led to an increase in racial violence in the North and West and an intensification of residential segregation. Five, exclusion or destruction of Black communities. Nationally, as African Americans left the South, entire states like Indiana and Oregon outright banned African Americans from living in the state. Peter Burnett, who later became the first governor of the state of California, was involved in passing these Oregon laws to ban Black residents from living in Oregon. In addition to entire states, many towns across the country became known as sundown towns, where African Americans were not allowed to remain after dark. Although these rules were often unwritten, local sheriffs and armed white mobs enforced them. Sundown towns were created largely between 1890 and 1940, and they legally continued to exist through 1968. The sociologist James Loewen argued that most suburbs in America began as sundown towns, and that the hometowns of 9 out of the 32 candidates for president in the 20th century were sundown towns. For example, Harry Truman grew up in Lamar, Mississippi, a legal segregation town of 3,000 without a single Black family. George W. Bush lived in Highland Park, a sundown suburb of Dallas that only welcomed its first Black homeowners in 2003. So again, George W. Bush lived in Highland Park, a sundown suburb of Dallas that only welcomed its first Black homeowners in 2003. California. Much like Indiana and Oregon, outright banned African Americans from living in the state as they left the South, California also tried to pass laws banning African Americans from settling in the state. Although the laws did not pass, the California legislature, dominated by white Southerners at the time, sent a clear message that African Americans were not welcome. For further discussion, see Chapter 2, Enslavement. Later, as residential segregation reached its height between 1940 to 1970, local governments and residents created scores of sundown towns and suburbs in California, some by ordinance and some by force. Loewen found evidence that 8 California counties effectively excluded Black people. While Californians rioted to expel Black residents from California towns, according to Loewen's research, California had more sundown towns than the entire South, which Loewen attributes to the culture of racism in the South, preferring to exploit rather than exclude Black residents. So again, they would rather exploit you than exclude you, as a way to get you money, labor, and all of that. California sundown towns included most of the suburbs of Los Angeles and San Francisco, and most of Orange County. Some of these places gained a national reputation as sundown towns. Loewen has collected research on numerous sundown towns throughout California. A list of the sundown towns identified by Loewen is included in Table 3 in the appendix to this chapter. Flyers for the Maywood colony of suburban development surrounding Corning, California announced good people. In most communities in California, you'll find Chinese, Japs, Diegos, Mexicans, and Negroes mixing up and working in competition with white folks. Not so much Maywood colony. Employment is not given to this element. In South Pasadena in the late 1940s, the city administration, local civic leaders, and realtors tried to cover South Pasadena with racially restrictive covenants. A 1947 newspaper article noted the unusual and extreme extent of this effort. The goal was to blanket the entire city with racially restrictive covenants. As a matter of official policy, African Americans and other non white persons were only allowed to work in South Pasadena if they left by dusk. Limited exceptions were made for live-in servants and caretakers, but they could not live in the city on their own and often could not bring their children to live with them. This campaign to exclude all non-white residents from South Pasadena only failed after the Supreme Court ruled that racially restrictive covenants could not be enforced. And as you see, they have a picture of the infamous Green Book here, which was a guide to keep you out of these racially charged areas. Okay. Let's see. Number 6, freedmen's towns. Nationally banned from settling in entire geographic areas and escaping discrimination and racial violence, African Americans began building all Black towns in the 19th century in the Southwest, Midwest, and West, also known as freedmen's towns. These towns developed in order to, in the words of one Blacktown newspaper editor, exercise freedom as freedom was understood by African Americans. Approximately 100 such towns were built between the early 1800s and mid-1900s. A particularly large number of African Americans migrated to Kansas. Oklahoma had over 30 all-Black towns. Other states with such towns included Texas, Iowa, New Mexico, and Michigan, as well as some of the former enslavement towns of Alabama, Mississippi, Kentucky, and Tennessee. California. Although there is not much research on the topic, some records suggest that there were at least 15 Black towns in California between 1850 and 1910. The best known and the most successful was Allensworth, 40 miles north of Bakersfield. Allen Allensworth, a formerly enslaved lieutenant colonel from the U.S. Army, founded Allensworth with others in 1908. The town attracted disillusioned Black migrants who had fled the South but found a different type of discrimination in California. Unlike other Black towns in California, Allensworth was self-governing, and at the height of its success before the Great Depression, over 300 families constructed churches, a library, a school, and a general store. Black midwives cared for the health of the community, and most doctors in nearby towns refused to take Black patients unless the patient was employed by a white rancher. Allensworth spent more money on its schools than its neighboring school districts. Cornelius Pope, who lived in Allensworth and attended school there as a child, remembered that his teacher, Alworth Hall, welcomed him to Allensworth School and with open arms and asked, "Learn something for me today." When Pope left Allensworth, he said, "It didn't take me long to find out that I was equal to the very best. I was just as powerful, could think just as good. There was nothing inferior about me. I was pretty hard to stop from there on in." Despite Allensworth's success, it was never truly independent. It had to rely on the government and white-owned companies that controlled the water, the railroad, and the job market. In testimony to the task force, Terrence Dean argues that water, land, and railroad companies discriminated against the town, leading to its demise. The Pacific Farming Company, after the first selling land plots to the black settlers at inflated prices, then prohibited land sales to African Americans, which limited the town's growth. Despite its promise, the Pacific Water Company built only 4 water wells for Allensworth compared to the 10 wells it built in a neighboring town. The water dried up within 2 years and was contaminated with alkaline at first, then arsenic in 1967. The founders maintained that the settlers were victims of racist scam and were sold land that would never have enough water. When it was founded, Allensworth was on the Santa Fe Railroad main line, which allowed the town to derive revenue from the rail stop. In 1914, the rail line was diverted away from Allensworth. Not being able to earn revenue from the railroad stop or farming alone, residents worked multiple jobs in the surrounding discriminatory white communities. Young people left the town to find jobs elsewhere, and Allensworth slowly died and disappeared as economic opportunities decreased and the water calcified. It was established as a state park in 1974, but remained critically underfunded and unbuilt until the 2000s. We were just in Allensworth not too long ago, and it is still critically underfunded and underbuilt. So hopefully they'll do something about that with these restitution that we're looking at. All right, number 7, city planning for segregation. Nationally, anti-Black zoning ordinances from the Civil War into 1960s as local governments planned the layout of their cities, they used planning regulations called zoning ordinances to prevent African Americans from living in certain neighborhoods. First, city officials in southern cities in the early 1900s passed black and white zoning ordinances to ban African Americans from living in white neighborhoods. When the U.S. Supreme Court found that these explicitly race-based zoning ordinances violated the federal Constitution in 1917, city officials used other zoning ordinances as proxies for race in order to maintain all white neighborhoods. From the 1860s to the 1900s, when African Americans first left the rural South for the urban South, racial violence escalated, leading to a number of large-scale race violence and massacres across the South. Soon after, anti-Black zoning ordinances were enacted in the South and nearby cities. In 1910, Baltimore enacted the city anti-Black zoning ordinance, making it illegal for Black people to move to blocks that were more than half white, and vice versa. Edgar Allan Poe, Baltimore city attorney and grandnephew of the famous poet, declared that the zoning was constitutional, and the city's mayor stated Blacks should be quarantined in isolated slums in order to reduce the incidence of civil disturbance, to prevent the spread of communicable disease into the nearby white neighborhoods, and to protect property values among white majorities. Numerous other southern cities followed Baltimore's example, including Winston-Salem, Atlanta, Oklahoma City, Miami, Birmingham, Dade County, Miami, Charleston, Dallas, Louisville, New Orleans, Richmond, and St. Louis. Although only about 10% of African Americans lived in the North at this time, anti-Black ordinances were popular nationwide. In 1915, the new republic argued for residential racial segregation until Negroes ceased wanting to amalgamate with whites. Company towns. Beginning in the late 18th century, large corporations planned and built entire towns for their workers and attracted them with benefits including housing and mortgages. When companies began hiring African Americans after the Great Migration, these companies typically offered Black workers housing that was lower in quality. In company towns like Gary, Indiana, and Sparrows Point in Baltimore County, Maryland, the best housing and jobs were reserved for American born white managers. The worst jobs and the smallest, shabbiest houses went to the African Americans. In Sparrows Point, Maryland, the site of Bethlehem Steel, Black residents were segregated from white residents. The room bungalows were with outhouses originally constructed for Black workers were given to white immigrants when there was a housing shortage. Black workers were forced to rent bunks in shanties that were originally intended as temporary housing. Racialized neighborhood zoning. After the Supreme Court declared explicit racial zoning unconstitutional in 1917, city officials developed new strategies to segregate Black residents from white residents by neighborhood. The federal government joined this effort in 1933. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's appointment to the National Land Use Planning Committee, Alfred Bettman, explained that cities and states needed to establish planning commissions for zoning to maintain the nation and the race. These new zoning strategies included, went a little bit too far there. Let's get back to it. Okay, these new zoning strategies included city official zoned neighborhoods for single-family homes without change for decades. This prevented apartment complexes from being built, which effectively kept out African Americans who were less likely to afford single-family homes. Influential experts like Columbia Law professor Ernest Freund stated that the coming of the colored people into a district was the more powerful reason for the use of zoning, rather than the creation of single-family neighborhoods. The United States Supreme Court decided that this type of zoning law was constitutional in 1977. Yeah, and I mean it still goes on today. I was at interjection. That's what Umario says during his interjection at a MMH planning meeting today. MMH is an acronym that stands for Missing Middle Housing. I don't know if that's just in Sacramento here or if that's something that's nationwide, but it's all about what we're talking about here, the NIMBYs allowing different mixed-use housing to be built into their area. So these laws still affect us to this day, but it looks like they're finally trying to make change. But I don't think it's for us. I think it's for the new influx of immigration. But let's continue. City officials relaxed or did not enforce zoning laws against white residents, but strictly enforced them against African Americans and other people of color, and effectively chased African Americans out of certain neighborhoods. City officials zoned Black residential communities and commercial or industrial, regardless of their residential character. This created a vicious cycle. Black residential communities zoned as commercial or industrial attracted polluting industries and lowered property values. White families would be less likely to move into the industrial zone, as white families generally had more money. As a result, it became increasingly difficult to remove the commercial or industrial zoning for these Black residential communities. City officials limited new buildings by banning or imposing large fees on new construction. Apartment buildings, mobile homes, or factory-built houses, a practice known as snob zoning. Cities also demanded development or architectural specifications. These ordinances had the effect of keeping poor people, large families. I gotta scroll back up to the top here. Older residents, single individuals, and people of color out of particular areas. City officials used dead end streets, highways, cemeteries, parks, industrial spaces, and rail lines to create boundaries between Black and white neighborhoods. Black people were even prohibited from burying the dead in white cemeteries and from using parks. These strategies were often used in combination to maintain the segregated nature of a neighborhood. For example, in the St. Louis metropolitan area, where 18-year-old Michael Brown was shot in 2014, city officials used a planning map that listed the race of each building's occupants to zone Black neighborhoods and the land next to Black neighborhoods for industrial development in 1919. The author of the city planning map explained that the goal was to prevent the movement into finer residential districts by colored people. In order to navigate the racial hostility that the segregation caused, African Americans created their own maps, travel guides, and other publications. For more information on this form of counter mapping, see Chapter 11, An Unjust Legal System. White neighborhoods were zoned as residential, and single-family homes in those neighborhoods used restrictive covenants, as discussed below, to prevent Black residents from moving in. This ensured that the Black neighborhood This ensured that the neighborhood stayed white. The Black neighborhoods were zoned to permit polluting industry, liquor stores, and brothels, which were banned in white neighborhoods. Later, the federal government cited the fact that Black neighborhoods were close to industry and vice as a risk to property values. Based on federal government's analysis, private banks refused mortgages to African Americans in a process called redlining. School sitting policy. City officials used the decision of where to build a school as a way to concentrate African Americans in poor neighborhoods with underfunded schools. This strategy is referred to as school sitting policy. Cities first banned Black families from sending their children to white schools, then moved the only school that Black students were allowed to attend into designated Black neighborhoods, and did not pay to transport Black students who lived outside the Black neighborhood. In 1928, the city of Austin, Texas, adopted a master plan to create a Negro district in order to implement segregation, which the plan warned cannot be solved legally under any zoning law known to us at present. The mechanism worked well. In 1930, Wheatsville, a racially mixed community in Austin, founded by a formerly enslaved person, was 16% Black. In 1950, the Black population of Wheatsville was 1%. After city officials segregated Austin, the Negro district on the east side had more unpaved streets, broken sewers, and fewer public transportation. The city did not enforce the residential zoning ordinances, so the neighborhood became increasingly industrial. City officials in Atlanta used segregation maps to guide the school board's decision on which schools to close and where to build new schools. California. Some scholars have argued that the first known attempt by an American city to segregate on the basis of race was 1890, when the San Francisco Board of Supervisors voted unanimously to move all Chinese people within San Francisco to a neighborhood set apart for Chinese residents and businesses. As African Americans arrived in California during the Great Migration, California used segregation to reinforce the racial hierarchy created by slavery. Northern California. In 1953, when the Ford Motor Company moved its plant to Milpitas, California, and the labor union tried to build housing for its black workers, the city rezoned the site for industrial use. The city also adopted a zoning ordinance banning apartment buildings. Anaheim, Costa Mesa, Orange, and Santa Ana zoned black residential communities as industrial to maintain neighborhood segregation. In 1958, the Palo Alto School District chose not to build two integrated high schools to solve overcrowding problems, but instead build a new school in the heart of the segregated Black Palo Alto neighborhood, further entrenching segregation in Palo Alto. Southern California. In California, the then prosperous Los Angeles neighborhood of Sugar Hill is another example of its effects of racialized zoning. Prominent African Americans like Hattie McDaniel, the first African American to win an Oscar for her role as Mammy in Gone with the Wind, and Norman Houston, co-founder of what became the largest Black-owned insurance company in the West, lived and singer Black-owned insurance company in the West lived, and singer Ethel Waters lived in the neighborhood. Waters remembered the day she moved into her house. During the day, the moving men had brought my things, and when I saw that they had placed each chair and table exactly where I wanted, I burst into tears. My house, I told myself, the only place I've ever owned all by myself. I felt like I was sitting on top of the world. I had a home at last. In 1945, the White Neighborhood Association sued to apply its restrictive covenant and evict the Black families living there. When the white neighbors lost their lawsuit, the Los Angeles City Council stepped in and rezoned the neighborhood for rentals despite the protests of the affluent Black families living there. In 1954, the city built the Interstate 10 Santa Monica Freeway through Sugar Hill and succeeded finally in destroying the community. Los Angeles City Council, the more things change, the more they stay the same. When South Los Angeles became a Black community in the 1940s, it had a mix of industrial plants and residential homes. The city of Los Angeles rezoned much of the neighborhood for commercial use. A plant explosion killed 5 local residents, 15 white workers, and destroyed more than 100 homes. When the pastor of the Black church protested that industrial zoning near his church, a city official replied, "Why don't you people buy a church somewhere else?" All right. 8, eminent domain. From the 1855 construction of iconic Central Park in New York City to the urban renewal in the 1970s, America built parks, highways, and new economic developments that destroyed Black or integrated neighborhoods. Government officials used a legal concept called eminent domain to confiscate property land owned by African Americans for these public uses. The U.S. Constitution demands that the government pay the landowners just compensation, which is usually fair market value, but often a disputed sum. These government decisions evicted African Americans from their homes and destroyed Black wealth. It shuttered thriving businesses and severed community ties. Alfred Johnson, the executive director of the American Association of State Highways officials and a lobbyist who worked on the 1956 Highway Act, put it in his, let me just scroll down a bit, way. Some city officials expressed the view in the mid 1950s that the urban interstates would give them a good opportunity to get rid of the local nigger town. Scholars disagree over whether federal, state, and local governments racially targeted Black neighborhoods for destruction or whether these public work projects were just situated in areas of least political resistance, which were incidentally Black neighborhoods. Regardless of intention, the effect is clear. One study in 2007 found that between 1949 and 1973, 2,532 eminent domain projects in 992 cities displaced millions of Americans, two-thirds of whom were Black. I could have guessed that. African Americans made up only 12% of the American population at the time, and so they were 5 times more likely to be displaced than they should have been when considering their portion of the population. These government actions destroyed the social, political, cultural, and economic networks created by a neighborhood. Evicted Black residents struggled to find a new place to live as the compensation offered by the government was often not high enough to buy or rent in other parts of the city. Evicted Black businesses lost their location and client base and were not usually compensated. Urban renewal displaced cultural centers, and in certain industries like jazz venues, it threatened the entire industry. Forced evictions also are associated with increased risk of stress-related disease like depression and heart attack. Park construction. The construction of parks in the United States has been used to harm Black people in many different ways. Parks have been used to destroy Black or integrated neighborhoods and act as a barrier between Black and white neighborhoods. The residents of these destroyed integrated neighborhoods were then resettled into segregated neighborhoods. Black neighborhoods themselves lack green spaces, as discussed in Chapter 7, Racism in Environment and Infrastructure. Leading to negative health effects, African Americans were often banned from public spaces, as discussed in Chapter 9, Control over Spiritual, Creative, and Cultural Life. Central Park in Manhattan was one of the most prominent examples of racial segregation by park constructions. Cities across the country copied Central Park's policies, regulations, and design. In 1855, about 1,600 people lived in the mixed area in mixed-race neighborhood called Seneca Village, Yorksville, and Pigtown. Even though state law at the time prevented Black New Yorkers from owning land, more than half of the Black households owned their homes in Seneca Village. The community included 2 Black churches and 1 racially mixed Episcopal church, a cemetery, and a Black school. City officials destroyed all of it by 1857 to build Central Park with an all-white male workforce. In California, at least one current park is on the site of the formerly thriving Black neighborhood. On the land that is currently Belmar Park in Santa Monica, the city of Santa Monica took away and burned down the homes and businesses of people in the Black neighborhood of Belmar Triangle through eminent domain for the construction of the city's expanded Civic Center, auditorium, and the Los Angeles County Courthouse. Now there is a park commemorating the neighborhood. The 1938 underwriting manual issued by the U.S. Federal Housing Administration, FHA, states a location close to a public park or area of similar nature is usually well protected from infiltration of business and lower social occupancy coming from that direction. Okay, slum clearance. Throughout the American history and across the country, government officials who are often white see discussion in Chapter 4, Political Disenfranchised. Okay, throughout American history and across the country, government officials who are often white, and as we see nowadays, white Latino, just throw that in there. But anyways, these white government officials labeled Black communities as slums, regardless of what the neighborhood was actually like. This allowed government officials to demolish so-called slums to make way for commercial development, upscale resident parks, universities, hospitals, and corporate headquarters. The federal government funded this strategy with the 1934 Housing Act and then again comprehensively with the 1949 Housing Act, which provided $13.5 billion for slum clearance and urban redevelopment between 1953 and 1986. At the height of urban development or urban renewal in 1967, the government destroyed 404,000 housing units, but only built 41,580 as replacements. For example, in 1953, the Memphis Housing Authority declared that 46 acres of middle-class Black-owned single-family homes was a slum and replaced it with 900 units of public housing. Homeowners had paid off their mortgages, improved their homes, and created a neighborhood. The homeowners are sick and distressed beyond measure, pleaded one resident in a letter to city authorities. In another example, after African Americans rebuilt Tulsa following the 1921 Tulsa massacre, city officials declared the Greenwood community to be a slum and destroyed it again. Highway construction and urban renewal also appear to have compounded the economic collapse of the Greenwood community. Freeway construction. And before we move on from the slum removal, as they call it, I always thought slum was like a slang term or something, just something that kind of came out of the culture. I had no idea that it was a government sanctioned term. Okay, freeway construction. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 built 41,000 miles of interstate highways and was the largest American public works program at the time. By the 1960s, highway construction was destroying 37,000 urban housing units per year. From 1956 until 1965, the federal government did not provide any assistance to people whose homes were destroyed. During the first 20 years of interstate highway construction, more than 1 million people were displaced. In 2021, the U.S. Secretary of Transportation acknowledged there is racism physically built into some of our highways because the federal highway system was built specifically to cut through neighborhoods where property values were the lowest. In most cities, federal highways were routed through black neighborhoods. For example, between 1948 and 1956, 86,000 people were displaced in Chicago, 66% of whom were black, even though at the time black people only made up approximately 20% of the city's population. In 1962, Detroit raised black communities to build the Interstate 75 Expressway, a plan that the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights warned in advance would displace 4,000 families, 87% of whom were black. U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development officials knew that they would destroy black homes and did nothing to help these black families. The government did little to help these mostly black family businesses, churches, and schools. The formerly thriving black neighborhood of Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, infamous for the deadly anti-black massacre of 1921, is now divided by Interstate Highway 244. Greenwood now has one block of businesses today before the highway construction. The neighborhood had 35 blocks of businesses and homes. Whenever affirmative infrastructure of this sort is constructed in black neighborhoods, the initial construction-related harms created are compounded by environmental pollution that is created and generated on an ongoing basis. Highway construction not only destroyed black neighborhoods, government officials also used it to fence African Americans into certain neighborhoods. A federal manual recommends that a high-speed traffic artery or wide street parking may prevent the expansion of inharmonious uses to a location on the opposite side of the street. The term inharmonious racial or national groups was used by the federal government to describe communities of color. In Chicago, 28 identical 16-story apartment buildings known as the Robert Taylor Homes were a national symbol of failed public housing and concentrated poverty. The project housed 27,000 residents, nearly all of whom were African American. The city of Chicago used the Day Ryan Expressway to cut off the Robert Taylor Homes from the surrounding neighborhood. Studies have shown that the interstate highways also fenced in black neighborhoods in Memphis, Richmond, Kansas City, Atlanta, Tulsa, and Charleston. California. In California, eminent domain was used against black communities as well as other communities of color. As in the rest of the country, California used park construction, slum clearance, and freeway construction to destroy black communities. On September 23rd and 24th, 2021, California residents Jonathan Burgess and Don Boschiano testified before the task force that state officials built the Marshall Gold Discovery State Historic Park in Coloma, California, on their family's land without just compensation. They also testified that the California Department of Parks and Recreation has not appropriately commemorated the history of the black families who own land. In Southern California, the city of Manhattan Beach destroyed a racially integrated beachfront neighborhood. Willa Bruce, who is black, had purchased the beachfront property in 1912 to run a lodge, cafe, and dance hall. White people in the area tried to push her out by slashing her tires, setting fire to a mattress under her deck, and posting no trespassing signs and fake parking restrictions to chase away black customers. In 1924, Manhattan Beach officials confiscated the beachfront property of several black and white families, including the Bruces, citing an urgent need for a public park. It was urgent, family. It just had to happen. The Bruces sued for $120,000 and received $14,500. The other families, black and white, received between $1,200 and $4,200 per lot. According to the Bruce family lawyer, the city did not pay for years and barred them from purchasing new land in the area, forcing the Bruces to leave without any income. Without any income. The land lay vacant for decades. Oh, I thought it was urgent. I thought that it was so urgent that they needed to build this park. But anyways, I digress. The land lay vacant for decades until a park was built in the 1950s. The family moved to South Los Angeles and eventually left California. Having lost their property, Willa and her husband Charles worked for other business owners for the remainder of their lives. Estimates of the fair market value today of the Bruce family land is between $40 million and $70 million. In the fall of 2021, the state of California authorized Los Angeles County to transfer the land back to the Bruce family after nearly 100 years. African Americans were pushed out of other beach cities as described by Dr. Allison Rose Jefferson to the task force on December 8, 2021. Initially, Santa Monica was not only home to an African American community, it was also a tourist destination for African Americans throughout Los Angeles area. But in 1922, a black investment group was blocked from developing a resort and amusement facility along the oceanfront. After the black investors could not build the facility, white developers purchased the land and constructed the Casa del Mar and Edgewater clubs in the area. Black investors were also unable to build a plan. Let's see, what were they planning to build? Black Membership Club, a planned black membership based club in Santa Monica in 1958 because the city took over the land throughout eminent domain proceedings for the purported parking lot. These investors asserted racial discrimination and attempted to stop the city's proceedings in court but lost. Now the upscale Viceroy Hotel is located at that site. In 1945, California passed the Community Redevelopment Act, which allowed for the redevelopment of blighted areas in urban and suburban communities. The law defined a blighted area as a social or economic liability that needed redevelopment for the health, safety, and general welfare of the communities in which they existed. An area was deemed blighted if one of the following conditions was present. Areas with buildings that had faulty interior arrangement and exterior spacing or housed a high density population, leading to overcrowding and infectious disease outbreak. Okay. Just really quick interjection with the word density there. At that MMH meeting I was telling you about, this development planning meeting, trying to undo some of these policies that were put into place that have harmed people in the housing. That's one thing that they mentioned. They said density is a bad word. You're not supposed to say that. Don't say density because, it'll get the NIMBYs upset. Okay, so density is a bad word. Okay, back to it. Areas with buildings that had inadequate provision for ventilation, light, or sanitation, open spaces, and recreation facilities for dilapidation. Areas with economic deterioration or underuse of valuable land. Areas with depreciated values that could generate more tax revenue to fund public services for the residents, and areas that were beyond remedy and contributed substantially to problems of crime. Each of these conditions describe the harms of residential segregation as discussed above. Buildings in Black neighborhoods are generally more likely to be overcrowded and are in poor condition because it was designed to be that way. And that's just my little take on it. I mean, it was designed to be that way. So, of course, that's the way it's going to be. As discussed in Chapter 7, Racism in Environment and Infrastructure, the effects of redlining made land in Black neighborhoods less valuable than they actually were, and local governments intentionally slowed and deprived these communities of services. Redlining concentrated poverty and the crime into Black communities, and implicit biases based in racist beliefs created during enslavement have to this day led the American public to associate African Americans with crime and contribute to the over and under policing of Black communities. In Northern California, this law was used to demolish the Fillmore, which was San Francisco's most prominent Black neighborhood and business district, known as the Harlem of the West. The Fillmore was an integrated neighborhood that was famous for its jazz venues that hosted Ella Fitzgerald, Billie Holiday, Charles Mingus, and Louis Armstrong. City agencies declared that the Western Addition was blighted in 1948 and began tearing it down in 1956. The plan was one of the largest projects of urban renewal on the West Coast. The city of San Francisco closed 883 businesses, displaced 4,729 households, destroyed 2,500 Victorian homes, and damaged the lives of nearly 20,000 people. The agency would go to a house and give the head of household a certificate that said that they would be given preference in housing built in the future. Benjamin Ibarra, a spokesman for the agency, said in 2008. But there wasn't a lot of housing built for a long time. The San Francisco city government left the land empty for many years. Sounds familiar. Oh, went up a little bit too far. Another example of a predominantly Black community in Northern California that urban development destroyed was Russell City. Founded in 1853 along the Hayward shoreline in Alameda County, Danish immigrants initially lived in Russell City. By World War II, Russell City became primarily Black and Latino. We were left to fend for ourselves. We had no public sewer system, so you saw many homes with outhouses. We had wells with no running water, an electrical grid that was so unstable that many times we were in the dark, said former Russell City resident Marion Eddie Edens, who stated that living in Russell City was the major challenge of her life. While Russell City lacked basic infrastructure and was economically poor, it was culturally rich community. Music and literature were my saving graces, recalled Gloria Branton Sanders Moore, former resident of Russell City. Blues legends like Ray Charles and Etta James were known to perform at Russell City clubs when touring the West. By the 1950s, Russell City was declared a blight by neighboring Hayward officials. In 1963, the local governments of the city of Hayward and Alameda County forcibly relocated all Russell City residents, bulldozed the community, and rezoned the land for industrial use. Descendants of Russell City residents claim that the displaced homeowners were forced to sell their land without fair compensation. In 2021, the Hayward City Council passed a resolution formally apologizing to former Russell City residents for its participation in racially discriminatory housing practices such as racial steering and redlining. In Southern California in 1950, the Los Angeles City Planning Commission planned to demolish 11 blighted areas. All but one were majority Mexican American or African American neighborhoods. Many of California's freeways were routed through Black neighborhoods, as noted above. The city of Los Angeles destroyed the prosperous Black neighborhood of Sugar Hill in 1954 by building an Interstate 10 freeway. Former residents said the amount that the government paid for their homes was inadequate and below market value. Los Angeles did it again in 1968 by building the Century Freeway through the Black neighborhoods of Watts and Willowbrook, displacing 3,550 families, 117 businesses, parks, schools, and churches. The Interstate 210 freeway destroyed a Black business district and racially diverse communities in Pasadena in the 1950s. The city offered residents $75,000 for their homes, less than the minimum cost of purchasing a new home in Pasadena. The freeway forced 4,000 Black and Mexican American residents to move back to the inner city Los Angeles. In Oakland, a total of 503 homes, 22 businesses, 4 churches, 155 trees, 155 trees were demolished to construct Interstate 980. Once completed in 1985, the highway served predominantly Black neighborhoods of West Oakland from the rest of the city. It's severed, not served, severed the predominantly Black neighborhoods of West Oakland from the rest of the city, setting the stage for underfunding of municipal projects in the area. In Fresno, the construction of Highway 41 and 99 destroyed blocks of homes where Black families lived. In San Diego, much like in other parts of the state, the construction of the freeway, such as Interstate 5, disrupted African American communities. And then, real quick, back to that MMH meeting I was out today. Same thing happened out here in our little Del Paso Heights district in Sacramento. They ran the freeway, the 160. It was once a thriving business community, historically Black area. They ran that 160 through, and it's been blighted and underfunded and underserved ever since. All right. So moving on to public housing. The construction of government funding housing or public housing has contributed to housing segregation in segregation in two major ways throughout American history. First, from World War I until 1950s, the federal government built high-quality housing. Generally, federal practices did not allow African Americans to live in these high-quality buildings, often building separate low-quality units for African Americans. Then, from 1950s to the as the federal government subsidized mortgages for white families to move to the suburbs and paid local governments to demolish racially integrated neighborhoods, it also built high-rise apartment buildings in urban neighborhoods that were cut off from the richer white suburbs. These high-rise public housing projects concentrated poverty in Black neighborhoods in the inner city. High-quality public housing for white Americans. Private real estate development stalled during the Great Depression due to the lack of available credit during the World Wars. All available raw material were directed went up a little bit far, were directed towards military use, and private housing construction was banned. By the end of the World War II, these conditions created severe housing shortages for all Americans, regardless of race. In response, the federal government built low-rise buildings for middle-class Americans that were scattered throughout the city, but did not subsidize the rent maintenance. Instead, tenants paid full market price and for buildings maintenance, so the quality of public housing was high. Let me read that again. All right. In response, the federal government built low-rise buildings for middle-class Americans that were scattered throughout the city, but did not subsidize the rent or maintenance. Okay, so they did not subsidize the rent or maintenance. Instead, tenants paid full market price for the building's maintenance, so the quality of public housing was high. Federal agencies funded public housing, which either barred African Americans or the housing available to African Americans was segregated and in worse condition. During World War I, the federal government built housing for white workers in wartime industries. 170,000 white workers and their families lived in 83 government building housing projects across 25 states. The federal government did not allow Black workers to live in this federally built housing and forced Black workers into overpopulated slums. There's that word, slums again. In 1933, the federal government created the Public Works Administration, PWA, which cleared slums and built houses using its neighborhood composition rule to require federal housing projects to maintain the racial makeup of the neighborhood. All across the country, in cities like Detroit, Indianapolis, Toledo, New York, Birmingham, and Miami, the PWA segregated Black residents from white residents either by project or by concentrating African Americans into high-density, low-income neighborhoods. Another federal agency, the Tennessee Valley Authority, built 500 comfortable houses and leased them to its employees and construction workers. The federal government banned Black federal workers from the houses who lived in low-quality barracks. In 1937, the federal government revised its strategy and created the U.S. Housing Authority, USHA, which gave federal money to local governments to build public housing. Although the USHA manual stated that government housing projects should not segregate what were previously integrated neighborhoods, it also warned local officials not to build housing for white families in areas now occupied by Negroes. During World War II, the federal government built housing for white workers in the defense industry. Black workers were either left to live in slums or in lower quality segregated housing. All right, let's just see where we are, fam. I know we're probably getting to pretty close to our stopping point. Yeah, I think we're about 15 pages in. So, I'm going to end it right there. and we will pick this up tomorrow with low quality housing for African Americans. So thanks for joining tonight. That's just what it is. I mean, and we're still experiencing these badges and instances and vestiges of slavery today. All right. So I guess we will just close it out with that. Thank you for joining so much, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye.
The way it currently stands, forced labor, slavery takes precedence over rehabilitation and public safety.
Oh, by the way, while the Biden administration gives reparations to everyone but free people, look at the billions he has run over to Ukraine.
We don't have black grocery stores because if you think about it now, just to get in that supply chain, it's almost unheard of.
They don't want the truth to get out. Okay? I don't want to know what my family did or what all these people did and all this stuff like that. Okay? You read that 500-page report.
There's this thing called white superiority and black inferiority. That mindset allows all of the behaviors that we've seen across generations, allows for the construction of these policies and practices and systems and structures that continue to oppress us. This is not a handout. This is a debt that is owed.
You know, Allensworth was like the internet of his time in 1904, 1905.
The total black population in California is about 2.6 million, and then of that, the descendants compose about 2.2 million of that. So California, with a multi-billion-dollar surplus, can absolutely afford to satisfy the international terms for reparations, beginning with compensation.
Any financial obstacle that exists that impedes the success of increasing financial prosperity needs to be dealt with and eliminated.
No matter where we've been, no matter what part of this fight we've been in, we've been harmed, and we've had harm done to us specifically.
When I got to Los Angeles, this was some of the worst segregation I'd ever seen. And remember, I'm telling you, I'm from Mississippi.
Because as you can see, I'm giving you broken history right now, you know? But I had to give it to you guys today. I said, no, I got to show them this because it's so precious and nobody really knows about it.
Black people don't have that kind of luxury. Our historically black communities have been redistricted multiple times.
Now listen, if you can't handle the TR roof, don't tune in.